Before we begin, understand this. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not exaggerated. It is not a story meant to entertain. This really happened. Behind the stone walls of Sing Sing prison in the 1890s, men entered alive and left erased. Some collapsed during forced labor. Some vanished into silence. Some died without their names ever reaching the outside world. This channel exists to tell the stories history tried to bury. If you believe the truth matters, if you want real American crime stories told without lies or distractions, and if you want to understand how power can turn deadly when no one is watching, then subscribe now. Because once this story begins, there is no turning away. The man collapsed without warning. One moment, he was standing in a narrow stone hallway, his back straight, his lips pressed tight in silence. The next, his knees buckled, and his body hit the cold floor of Sing Sing prison with a dull, hollow sound. Guards rushed toward him, boots echoing off the walls. One of them nudged the man with his foot. He did not move. The rule at Sing Sing was simple. Prisoners did not speak. Prisoners did not complain. Prisoners did not slow down. And prisoners did not die quietly. But this one had. As other inmates stood frozen in their cells, staring through iron bars, the guards dragged the lifeless body away. No doctor was called right away. No alarm was raised. To the prison, this was not an emergency. It was a problem to be removed. By the next morning, the man's name was gone from the records. The official report would later say he died from natural weakness. No mention of the long hours of labor, no mention of the punishments, no mention of the silence that had slowly crushed him. This was Sing Sing prison in the 1890s, and this death was not the first. But it would not be the last. What happened inside those stone walls was hidden from the public. Families outside would never hear the full truth. And as the prison continued to operate, something darker was growing inside. Because Sing Sing was not just holding criminals, it was breaking them. And soon, the silence itself would begin to kill. That story begins long before this man collapsed on the floor. It begins with a prison built to frighten the entire nation. Sing Sing prison sat on the eastern bank of the Hudson River in New York. Its tall stone walls rose like a fortress, meant to warn anyone who looked at it. Built from the same rock prisoners were forced to cut by hand, the prison was a monument to punishment. By the late 1800s, Sing Sing had become one of the most feared prisons in America, not because it held the worst criminals, but because of how it treated every man inside. The prison followed what was called the Auburn system. Silence was the law. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to each other at any time, not during work, not during meals, not even at night. If an inmate whispered, looked the wrong way, or failed to move fast enough, punishment followed. Guards carried clubs, some carried whips. Solitary confinement cells waited for those who broke the rules. These cells were small, dark, and cold. Men could spend days or weeks inside, alone with their thoughts. Many did not come out the same. Most inmates were forced into hard labor from sunrise to sunset. They worked in stone yards, workshops, and factories inside the prison. The work was heavy. The pace was cruel. Rest was rare. In the 1890s, Sing Sing was overcrowded. Cells designed for one man sometimes held two. Air barely moved through the stone halls. Disease spread easily, but the work never stopped. The prison made money from inmate labor. That meant exhaustion was ignored. Injury was overlooked. Weakness was punished. To the prison leaders, prisoners were not people. They were tools, and tools were replaceable.
Reports of abuse began to leak outside the prison. Former inmates spoke of beatings for small mistakes, of men collapsing at work and being forced to stand again, of guards who punished not to correct, but to control. But most of these stories were dismissed. After all, they came from prisoners, and prisoners were not believed. Inside Sing Sing, the silence did more than stop conversation. It erased identity. Men forgot the sound of their own voices. Some began talking to themselves in whispers, risking punishment just to hear words again. Others stopped speaking altogether. The guards believed silence created order. In truth, it created fear. Fear kept men obedient. Fear kept secrets buried. By the mid-1990s, inmate deaths became harder to ignore. Men died from illness, exhaustion, and injuries that were never properly treated. Some died suddenly, others faded slowly, growing thinner and weaker until they collapsed. Each time, the prison issued short explanations: heart trouble, fever, natural causes. But doctors who later reviewed some cases raised questions. How could so many young men die so quickly? Why were injuries missing from reports? Why were autopsies rare? The answers pointed back to the same place.
The inside of Sing Sing. Corruption played a quiet but powerful role. Some guards accepted bribes, some sold privileges, others looked the other way when rules were broken by those in power. Complaints disappeared, records were changed, witnesses were punished. If an inmate tried to report abuse, he risked retaliation. More labor, less food, more time in solitary. The system protected itself, and it punished anyone who challenged it. Families on the outside waited for letters that never came. Prisoners were allowed limited contact, and many letters were censored or destroyed. Loved ones had no idea what daily life was really like. To the public, Sing Sing was tough but fair. To the men inside, it was a slow grind toward collapse. Then, one winter evening in the 1890s, something happened that even the prison could not fully hide. An inmate refused to stand. Guards ordered him again. He did not move. Other prisoners watched in silence as the guards surrounded him. The tension was thick. Everyone knew what usually came next. But this time, the punishment went too far. By the end of the night, the inmate was dead. And this time, too many people had seen it. Whispers began moving through the prison, carried in glances and pauses, in the shared understanding of fear. Outside the walls, rumors started to spread. Something was wrong at Sing Sing, and the truth was pressing against the silence, ready to break through. But before that truth could be told, the prison would try one last time to bury it, and the cost would be another life. The body was gone by morning. The stone hallway where the inmate had fallen was scrubbed clean. The floor looked the same as it always did, cold, gray, silent. To anyone walking past, it was just another day inside Sing Sing prison. But the men locked in their cells knew better. They had seen what happened. They had seen how quickly a man could disappear, and they understood the message clearly. Do not resist. Do not speak. Do not slow down, or you will be next. The prison returned to its routine as if nothing had happened. Bells rang before sunrise. Cell doors opened with sharp metal sounds. Inmates lined up, eyes forward, mouths closed. Guards walked beside them, watching every step. Work began immediately. Men lifted stone blocks heavier than their own bodies. Others bent over machines for hours, hands shaking, backs aching. If someone stumbled, a guard stepped closer. If someone paused too long, punishment followed. Pain was normal here. Fear was constant, and silence ruled everything. By the 1890s, Sing Sing was packed far beyond what it was built to hold. Cells meant for one man now held two. Some prisoners slept sitting up, others took turns lying down.
Air barely moved. In summer, the heat crushed them. In winter, the cold bit into their bones. Disease spread easily. Coughs echoed through cell blocks at night. Fevers burned unchecked. Medical care was slow or missing altogether. Still, the work continued. The prison depended on it.
Weakness was seen as disobedience. Injury was seen as an excuse. If a man could still stand, he was sent back to work. If he could not, he was dragged away. Some never returned. Guards held enormous power. Many followed orders without question. Others used their authority to control through fear. A look, a raised hand, a step closer than necessary. Punishment did not always leave marks that outsiders could see. Solitary confinement was one of the worst tools. A man could be locked in a small, dark cell for days, sometimes weeks. No talking, no work, no sound but his own breathing. Men came out changed. Some shook uncontrollably. Some could not look others in the eye. Some forgot how to speak at all. The prison called it discipline. The inmates called it breaking. Complaints were dangerous. If an inmate accused a guard of abuse, the system moved against him. Records were written by prison officials. Doctors worked for the prison. Witnesses were other inmates who feared punishment themselves. Truth had no place here. Outside the walls, Sing Sing's leaders spoke proudly of order and reform. Newspapers described the prison as strict but necessary. Most people believed that men sent there deserved whatever happened to them. That belief protected the prison. But cracks were beginning to show. A former guard quietly told a reporter that deaths were being hidden. A prison worker mentioned injuries that never appeared in official logs. A doctor hinted that some inmates were dying from exhaustion, not illness. These whispers did not name names. They did not prove anything, but they raised questions. Inside Sing Sing, guards felt the pressure. Orders came down to tighten control. Silence was enforced more harshly. Punishments increased. The message was clear. Do not let the prison look weak. That only made things worse. Tensions grew between inmates and guards. Men were pushed harder. Food portions shrank. Rest time disappeared. The prison felt like a machine running too fast, grinding everyone inside it. Then winter came. Cold winds cut through the Hudson River valley. Inside the stone prison, temperatures dropped sharply. Blankets were thin, clothing was worn. Men shivered through the nights, waking stiff and sore. Illness spread quickly. Several inmates collapsed during work details. Guards ordered them to stand. Some did, some could not. One man fell near the stone yard gates. He was known for keeping quiet and following rules. He was not a troublemaker. Witnesses later said he had been coughing for days. That did not matter. He was dragged to his feet and forced back to work. By evening, he was dead. The official report said pneumonia. No mention of exhaustion. No mention of the collapse. No mention of witnesses. For the inmates, fear turned into something else. Anger. Not loud anger, not spoken anger, but a deep, dangerous anger that sat in their chests and waited. Men began exchanging looks during work, brief glances, small signs of shared understanding. They could not speak, but they could see. Something was wrong, and it was not stopping. In early 1895, a state inspection was announced. Word spread quickly through Sing Sing. Guards straightened uniforms, cells were cleaned, food portions were increased for a few days. Inmates were warned. Say nothing. Look forward. Follow the rules. Inspectors walked through the prison, escorted by senior officials. They saw neat lines and quiet men. They heard rehearsed answers. They were told everything was under control. But they did not see the punishments that happened at night. They did not hear the cries from solitary cells. They did not see the injuries hidden under prison clothes. The inspection ended. Life returned to normal.
worse than before. Those suspected of speaking to inspectors were watched closely. One inmate was suddenly reassigned to harder labor. Another was sent to solitary without explanation. Fear returned stronger than ever. Then came the incident that the prison could not erase. A young inmate collapsed during morning labor. He did not move. Guards tried to lift him. His body was limp, cold. This time, a doctor was called. Too late. The man was pronounced dead inside the prison yard. Unlike before, this death happened in full view. Dozens of inmates saw it. Several guards did too. Rumors spread fast. A local newspaper heard about it within days. Questions followed. Why was a sick man forced to work? Why had he not been treated earlier? Why were so many deaths happening at Sing Sing? Prison officials denied wrongdoing. They said the inmate had been weak. They said death was unavoidable. But the public was listening now. Families of inmates began asking questions. Letters were sent to state officials. Reformers demanded answers. Sing Sing's silence was cracking. Inside the prison, tension reached a breaking point. Guards felt watched. Inmates felt trapped. Every order carried weight. Every punishment felt heavier. One night, during a late work detail, an argument broke out. It was small. A guard shouted. An inmate hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. The guard raised his club. Other inmates froze. What happened next would decide whether Sing Sing's secret stayed buried or finally came to the light. And as the club came down, everyone watching knew one thing for certain. This prison was about to expose itself. The club stopped in midair. For a single second, the entire prison seemed to hold its breath. The guard's arm froze, not because of mercy, but because of the sound behind him. Boots, fast, heavy. Senior officers were rushing in. Someone had shouted. Someone had seen too much. The inmate who had hesitated stood shaken, eyes locked forward, lips pressed tight. He knew what usually came next. Pain, solitary, maybe worse. But this time, the rules bent. The guard lowered his arm. The officers exchanged looks. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Too many eyes were watching now. The inmate was pulled away, not beaten, not dragged, just removed. He disappeared down a side corridor. No one knew where he was taken, and that scared the others even more, because when Sing Sing did not punish loudly, it punished quietly. By morning, whispers moved through the prison in the only way they could, through looks, through pauses, through the heavy silence that carried fear like a disease. Something had changed. Outside the walls, the pressure was growing. Newspapers were asking questions that would not go away. Reform groups demanded inspections that were not announced in advance. State officials could no longer ignore the rumors of abuse and death. Sing Sing prison was becoming a problem. Inside, the leaders tried to regain control. Guards were ordered to follow the rules closely, at least in public. Punishments became more hidden. Solitary cells filled at night instead of during the day. The silence returned, tighter than before. But silence could not stop what was already moving. Former inmates began to speak, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to form a pattern. Stories of exhaustion, of beatings for small mistakes, of men who entered healthy and left broken, if they left at all. Doctors outside the prison reviewed death records and noticed something strange. Too many deaths were labeled natural. Too few injuries were recorded. Ages did not match causes. A quiet investigation began. Inside Sing Sing, the inmates felt it before they knew it. Guards were nervous. Orders were sharp. Mistakes were punished quickly. Fear ran both ways now. Then came the winter inspection that no one expected. This time, there was no warning. Inspectors arrived without notice and demanded access to everything. Cell blocks, medical rooms, solitary cells, records. Guards could not prepare. Prison leaders could not clean the truth away fast enough. Inspectors saw thin men with hollow eyes. They saw injuries that did not match reports. They stepped into solitary cells and felt the cold. They noticed how long men were kept inside. They asked questions, and this time they did not accept easy answers. One inspector noticed something small but telling, a medical log that skipped days, names missing, times changed. When asked, the prison doctor hesitated. That hesitation said everything. The investigation spread beyond the prison walls. Lawmakers demanded explanations. Editors printed stories that shocked readers. Families recognized names of the dead. Sing Sing's image began to crack in public view. But inside Sing Sing, life did not suddenly improve. In fact, it became more dangerous. Guards felt cornered. Some blamed inmates for speaking out, even when no one had spoken. Punishments increased again, especially for those who looked weak or afraid. One inmate, older than most, had been at Sing Sing for years. He knew the routines. He knew when to stay invisible, but his body was failing. One morning, he could not lift his tools. His hands shook too badly. A guard shouted. The man tried again. He dropped the tool. Silence fell across the yard. Everyone knew what dropping a tool meant. The guard stepped forward. The old inmate did not raise his eyes. He waited, but the punishment did not come right away. Instead, the man was pulled from the line and taken inside. He never returned. Days passed, then weeks. His name was removed from work lists. Other inmates noticed. Guards refused to answer questions. Later, a short notice appeared in the records. Deceased. No date, no cause. This death, quiet and clean on paper, became a turning point because by then, the public was watching. Investigators returned, this time with authority. They demanded access to solitary confinement records. They asked about missing inmates. They compared lists. Names did not match. Sing Sing Prison, once proud of its order, now looked careless, or worse. Officials defended themselves. They said prisons were hard places. They said inmates were sick. They said discipline was misunderstood. But the stories no longer lined up. One lawmaker stood on the prison grounds and said something that made headlines. This is not justice. This is destruction. The word spread fast. Inside Sing Sing, guards heard them. Inmates heard them too, through rumors and looks and the rare whisper when no one was near. Hope, dangerous as it was, began to grow. Not hope for freedom, hope for truth. That hope made the prison leadership desperate. Records were adjusted, witnesses were moved, guards were reassigned. The system tried to protect itself one last time. But systems built on silence cannot survive light. By the late 1990s, Sing Sing faced public shame. Reports confirmed abuse, neglect, and deadly conditions. Reforms were promised. Some officials were removed. Rules were rewritten. But for the men who had already died, it was too late. For those still inside, change came slowly, very slowly.
The silence was loosened, but not broken. Labor continued. Solitary cells remained. Fear never fully left. Sing Sing did not transform overnight, but it was no longer invisible. The deaths of the 1990s left scars that could not be hidden again. They became warnings, lessons written in names that had once been erased. Today, Sing Sing still stands. Its walls still rise along the Hudson River, but behind those walls lives a memory of what happens when punishment replaces humanity, when silence is enforced, when power goes unchecked. The men who died there did not die in vain. Their suffering forced a nation to look inside its prisons and ask a question that still matters today. What happens when justice forgets mercy?
And the most unsettling truth of all remains. If it happened once, behind those walls, it could happen again. If this story feels heavy, that is because it should. Everything you're hearing actually happened. Real men, real suffering, real silence. And there are many more stories like this that history never teaches. If you want more real U.S. true crime stories, more prison cases, more hidden deaths, and more truth without sugarcoating, then take a second to subscribe. It tells the platform that these stories matter, and it helps keep forgotten voices alive. Now, let's continue. The gates closed with the same heavy sound they always had. Metal on metal. Final, unforgiving. From the outside, Sing Sing looked calm again. The river flowed past its stone walls. Guards stood at their posts. Schedules were followed. On paper, reforms had begun. But inside, the prison remembered everything. Men still woke before dawn. They still lined up in silence. They still worked until their bodies ached. The rules were softer now, but fear does not disappear just because someone writes a new rule. Fear lives longer than paper. After the investigations, some guards were moved. A few officials lost their jobs. New words entered the prison language: reform, oversight, humanity. But for the inmates, change felt distant. They had learned not to trust promises. The men who survived the worst years carried the weight of what they had seen. They remembered the bodies dragged away, the names erased, the nights when coughing turned into silence. Some were released after serving their sentences. When they stepped outside, the world felt too loud, too open, too fast. Many never spoke about Sing Sing again. Others tried. They told their stories in quiet rooms to reporters, to reformers, to anyone who would listen. They spoke of long hours, empty stomachs, and punishment without mercy. They spoke of men who went in healthy and never came out alive. At first, people listened with doubt. Then more voices joined in, and doubt turned into concern. Across America, Sing Sing became a warning. Other prisons were inspected, other systems questioned. Lawmakers began asking uncomfortable questions about how inmates were treated and why deaths were so easily explained away. The idea that prisons could be places of reform, not destruction, began to grow. Slowly, painfully, too late for many. Inside Sing Sing, the silence was no longer absolute. Inmates were allowed limited speech. Some work conditions improved. Medical care, though still basic, was watched more closely. But the building itself carried its past. The stone walls held echoes. Guards who had worked there for years said the prison felt different after the scandals, heavier, like the walls were listening now. New inmates arrived with stories already in their heads. They had heard the name Sing Sing before stepping inside. They knew what it meant. Fear walked in with them. And even with reforms, fear still found places to hide. One former inmate later said something that stayed with those who heard it. Sing Sing didn't just lock up bodies, it tested how much suffering people would accept before they looked away. That test did not end in the 1890s. It continued. Prison reform moved forward in small steps. Some states changed laws, others resisted. The belief that criminals deserved whatever happened to them was hard to erase. It was easier to blame the inmate than the system. Sing Sing's past became part of American history, taught quietly, if at all. The names of the dead were rarely spoken. Their stories faded into reports and forgotten files. But the questions they raised never fully went away. What is punishment for? Who watches the watchers? And how many deaths are too many before a system is forced to change? Today, Sing Sing still operates. The uniforms are different, the rules have changed. Cameras watch places that once hid secrets, but the walls are the same. And walls remember. Every generation believes it is better than the last, more fair, more careful, more humane. History warns otherwise, because Sing Sing was once considered modern, organized, necessary, until it wasn't. The men who died there in the 1890s did not choose to become symbols. They were ordinary people caught inside an extraordinary system of control. Their suffering exposed a truth that still matters. When silence is forced, abuse grows. When power is unchecked, lives are lost. And when the public looks away, darkness has room to work. Sing Sing's story is not just about one prison. It is about what happens when fear becomes policy and punishment replaces compassion. It is a reminder written in stone and memory. And the most haunting part is this: every prison has walls, every system depends on trust, and every era believes it would never repeat the mistakes of the past, until it does.
The first scream was not loud. It was short, sharp, cut off too quickly. Most people outside Sing Sing would never have noticed it. Inside the prison, every man did. Screams were rare now, not because pain was gone, but because men had learned what screaming cost them. When a sound like that broke the air, it meant something had gone very wrong. Guards moved fast. Boots hit stone. Orders were whispered, not shouted. The noise was swallowed by the walls almost as soon as it appeared. By morning, there was no sign of what had happened. No announcement, no explanation, no name spoken aloud. But one cell stayed empty. The inmate who had occupied it the night before did not return. This was the truth about Sing Sing after the scandals. The violence did not vanish. It adapted. It learned to hide better. Reforms had changed the rules, but they had not changed the building, the habits, or the mindset that had ruled the prison for decades. Power still sat in the same hands. Silence still protected it. And inmates still paid the price. The men inside now understood something important. The world was watching Sing Sing, but not closely enough, not all the time. That small gap was where fear lived. Older inmates taught the new ones how to survive. Keep your head down. Do your work. Do not draw attention. Do not trust promises. And never forget where you are. Because Sing Sing did not forgive mistakes. The prison became quieter in a different way. Not the forced silence of the past, but a careful one. Conversations were short. Movements were controlled. Hope was handled like something fragile that could shatter at any moment. Outside, reformers argued that progress was being made. Reports showed fewer deaths, better conditions, more oversight. Numbers looked better, but numbers did not tell stories. The men inside still carried the memories. They remembered the 1890s not as a time that ended, but as a shadow that followed them. One former inmate later said the worst part was not the work or the punishment. It was knowing that if something happened to you, the prison could erase you. And most people would never ask why. That truth shaped how inmates lived. It also shaped how guards behaved. Younger guards came in trained under new rules. Older guards brought old habits. Tension grew between them. Some wanted change. Others believed fear was the only thing that kept order. Arguments happened out of sight. Authority was tested quietly. And sometimes that tension exploded. One evening, during a routine count, a disagreement broke out between two guards near a cell block. Voices rose just enough for inmates to hear. It did not last long. A supervisor arrived. The voices stopped. But inmates noticed something important. The guards were no longer united. That crack mattered, because systems built on fear rely on unity at the top. When that unity breaks, control weakens. Soon after, an inmate collapsed during work detail again. This time, guards stopped the line immediately. A doctor was called at once. The man survived. That would have been unthinkable 10 years earlier. Inmates noticed. They remembered. For the first time, the idea that the system could change did not feel like a lie. But hope never comes without cost. Not everyone welcomed change. Some guards felt exposed, watched, threatened. They believed reforms made the prison weaker and inmates bolder. Punishments returned in small ways: extra work, less food, longer hours. Nothing obvious enough to make headlines, just enough to remind inmates who still held power. The prison stood between two worlds, one foot in its brutal past, one foot in an uncertain future. And that made it dangerous. A small group of inmates began to talk about speaking out after release. Not loudly, not together, just the idea of telling the truth when they were free. Word of this reached the guards. What happened next was never written down. One of those inmates was transferred suddenly, no reason given. Another was placed in solitary for weeks. A third stopped talking altogether. Fear returned like a cold wind. The message was clear. Some stories were still not meant to be told. As the years passed, Sing Sing's name slowly changed in the public mind. It was no longer just a symbol of cruelty. It became a symbol of reform in progress. That image helped officials. It helped lawmakers. It helped people feel better about the system. But it did not fully help the men inside. Because reform is not a moment. It is a process. And processes move slowly when power resists them. Sing Sing's greatest legacy was not its walls or its rules. It was the lesson it forced onto the nation, that prisons are easy to build and hard to fix, that suffering can be hidden inside plain, and that once a system learns it can get away with cruelty, it will test how far it can go again. Long after the 1890s, long after the headlines faded, Sing Sing continued to shape how America thought about punishment. Other prisons followed its example. Some copied its worst ideas before learning its lessons. Others ignored the warnings entirely. The men who died inside Sing Sing never saw these debates. They never saw reforms, or reports, or promises. They only knew the floor beneath them, the work before them, and the silence around them. Their stories survived not because the system wanted them to, but because people refused to forget. And forgetting is the most dangerous thing of all. Because when we forget, we repeat.
Sing Sing still stands today, not just as a prison, but as a reminder carved into stone and history, that justice without humanity becomes cruelty, that silence can kill, and that the cost of looking away is always paid by someone else. The next time the gates close, the sound will be the same as it was more than a century ago: heavy, final, unforgiving. The question is not whether prisons can change. The question is whether we will notice when they don't.
The man's hands would not stop shaking. He tried to hide them by folding his arms, but the movement only made it worse. The guard noticed. He always noticed. The guard's eyes stayed on the hands for a long second, then moved on. The man let out a breath he did not know he was holding. This was how life worked inside Sing Sing now. Not loud violence, not open cruelty, but watching, waiting, measuring weakness. The man's name was Thomas. He had arrived years after the worst scandals, long after newspapers had stopped printing daily stories about Sing Sing. To the public, the prison had changed. To Thomas, it felt like stepping into a place that never forgot how to hurt people. He had heard the stories before he arrived. Every inmate had. The deaths, the silence, the men who vanished. guards laughed at those stories and called them old lies, but Thomas felt the truth the moment the gate closed behind him. The air felt heavy, not just cold stone and iron, but memory, like the walls themselves were listening. Thomas followed the rules. He worked hard. He spoke little. He learned quickly which guards were safe to avoid and which ones were simply safer than others. Still, the prison found ways to test him. Long hours, short meals, orders that came too fast to follow perfectly, mistakes that were not really mistakes. He saw other men break down. One stopped eating, another stared at the wall for hours, a third whispered to himself at night, barely moving his lips. Guards called it weakness. Thomas saw it for what it was, survival failing. The older inmates watched Thomas closely. They could tell who might last and who might not. One of them, a man with gray in his hair and scars on his hands, finally spoke to him one night. "Don't let them rush you inside," he whispered, risking punishment. "That's where they get you." Thomas nodded. He understood. Sing Sing did not always break bodies first. It broke time. Days blurred together. Weeks passed without meaning. The future shrank to the next bell, the next order, the next meal. That was the real punishment, and it was the same punishment men had faced decades earlier. One afternoon, a new inmate collapsed in the workshop. The room froze. Thomas felt his heart pound. He had heard what used to happen when someone fell. This time, guards acted fast. The man was helped up, taken away. People said that meant progress. Thomas wasn't sure, because later that night, the man's cell was empty. No explanation, no name spoken. Progress, Thomas learned, could still erase people quietly. As months passed, Thomas began to understand why Sing Sing's past mattered so much. The prison had learned from its mistakes, but not in the way reformers hoped. It had learned how to avoid attention. Punishments were smaller but constant. Control was softer but deeper. Fear was spread carefully, like drops of water instead of floods, enough to keep everyone in line. Thomas wrote letters when he could. Most were censored. Some never left the building. His family thought he was doing fine. That was what the prison wanted. One winter night, Thomas heard crying from a nearby cell. It was low and broken, like someone trying not to be heard. The sound stopped suddenly. The next morning, that cell was empty. Guards said the inmate had been transferred. Thomas never saw him again. The past pressed closer. He remembered the stories of the 1890s, of men worked until they fell, of deaths explained away, of silence enforced like law. The methods had changed. The outcome felt the same. Then, something unexpected happened.
A guard spoke to him. Not an order, not a threat. A sentence. "You all think we don't know this place is wrong sometimes," the guard said quietly, standing too close. "But knowing and fixing aren't the same thing." Thomas did not reply. He did not need to. That sentence said everything. Sing Sing was trapped by its own history, afraid of being exposed again, afraid of losing control, afraid of change that might weaken authority. Fear built the prison. Fear kept it running, and fear made it dangerous. Thomas was eventually released. He walked out through the same gates, hearing the same sound men had heard for more than 100 years. Heavy, final. But this time, the gate opened outward. Freedom felt strange, loud, bright, too open. Thomas slept poorly for months. He flinched at sudden sounds. He avoided small rooms. People asked him what Sing Sing was like. He never gave long answers. How do you explain a place that learned how to hurt without leaving marks? Years later, when another prison scandal broke somewhere else in America, Thomas watched the news in silence. Different state, different building. Same words. Abuse, neglect, deaths. Officials promised reforms. The cycle repeated. That was Sing Sing's true legacy. Not just what happened inside its walls, but how easily it could happen again somewhere else. The men of the 1890s had warned the future with their suffering. Thomas had felt that warning in his own bones. And still, the system kept testing its limits. Sing Sing remained standing. Its stones older now. Its history heavier. It is no longer just a prison. It is a lesson about power without mercy, about silence enforced in the name of order, about how cruelty can change shape but keep the same purpose. The gates will continue to open and close. Men will continue to enter believing they can endure anything. And the question will remain, how much suffering is hidden behind walls we choose not to see? Because Sing Sing's story does not end in the past. It waits. Sing Sing still stands. The walls are older now. The rules are different. But the questions remain. How much suffering can hide behind locked doors? How many voices are silenced before anyone listens? And how often history repeats itself when we stop paying attention? This channel exists to remember the people who were erased, to expose the systems that failed, and to make sure these stories are never forgotten again. If you want more real American true crime, more prison stories, more hidden history, and more truth told without fear, subscribe to the channel, because silence is how these stories disappear. And together, we won't let that happen.